Brought to you by Charity Mobile. Switch to the phone company that supports your beliefs. All plans start under $50 before taxes and surcharges. Use promo code TRADITION at CharityMobile.com for a special offer. I hinted at something over the weekend, if you watched my live stream yesterday or Saturday, that a bombshell admission was made, or claim, if you prefer, by Austin Ivere. He is the papal biographer. At least he was for Pope Francis. I have called him a professional Francis fan fiction writer in the past, partially because he wrote the biographies for Francis, and I think he was the ghostwriter for Pope Francis's books. And in those works, he did his best to paint a picture for you of Pope Francis. But I've also told you that if you can find a first edition copy of his book, The Great Reformer, it is one of the most eye-opening, jarring reads you will ever find, because there's a chapter in there that tells you about then Cardinal, and before that Archbishop Jorge Mario Bergoglio, and his relationship with the military dictatorship of Argentina. And it goes a long way to explaining everything, to the point where in future editions of the book, after the first edition, most of that material was removed. He told too much. He is prone to often telling you too much. But he's also prone to painting a picture of Pope Francis that you will find very favorable. Why are we talking about Pope Francis? Man's been gone now for a month. Because we have an article here, and there's other things that go with it that I'll cover also here. We have an article from him, published by Commonweal. The title is Bridge Builder, How Robert Prevost Became Leo XIV. And in this article, Austin Ivere is going to paint you a picture, and that it was that Jorge Bergoglio, Pope Francis, handpicked his successor, that he trained him for years to prepare him to be Pope. There's some pushback to this. I'll give you it in the interest of truth. Remember, we are in the truth interest here. J.D. Flynn of The Pillar posted this. He is editor and co-founder of The Pillar. Okay. He says, there are people left and right. Again, left and right applied to church matters is always troubling, but he says, noting that Francis and Cardinal Prevost used to meet every Saturday for 2 hours. They're suggesting this implies an unusually close partnership, but it is standard operating procedure that Pope and bishops prefects have their weekly meeting to go over appointments. Perhaps. Others will point out that Francis and Fernandez, as prefect for the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith, met every week on a regular basis. Perhaps. But the claim Austin Ivere is making here goes deeper than that. And when you hear this, just go back in your mind. If you watched, like most people here did, the day the white smoke came out of that chimney at St. Peter's, the first two men in the audience who were Cardinals Walter Casper and Donald Wuerl. Bergoglians through and through. Cardinal Supich was seen briefly on the loggia behind Pope Leo XIV. In that, going into the conclave, people were reporting, very savvy reporters who were seeing James Martin and watching how he was on television, pointing out to people that he acted as if he knew something was up. Bear all that in mind. This could all be propaganda from a professional propagandist, but this has caused conversation online, a very serious one. I wouldn't dismiss the things he is saying entirely. Let's go over his detail. Let's go over what he has to say. After burying Pope Francis, the cardinals chose another pope from the Americas to follow in his path, proving both that the change of era inaugurated by Francis is here to stay, and that Latin America would still be a key source for the universal church. Leo XIV is from the south suburbs of Chicago, the descendant of immigrants who in turn chose to emigrate, as he put it to the Holy See ambassadors on May 16th. He was referring to the decades he spent as a missionary and bishop in Peru. This is why the first U.S.-born pope is also the second from South America. The quiet 69-year-old American, Robert Francis Prevost, friar of the Order of St. Augustine, slipped past the bookmakers and the pundits, quickly overtaking the Italian curial establishment papabile, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, to be elected after only 4 ballots on the afternoon of the second day of the conclave. As they emerged from the conclave, the cardinals were delighted, as if they had stumbled on a pearl of great price. They spoke of the atmosphere inside, the light-hearted peace in the Sistine Chapel, the sense of fraternity and unity back at the Santa Marta. They remarked on the freedom from the pressures and distractions of the internet that allowed them to settle prayerfully on the one man among whom they believed God had chosen. I will point out here, the young cardinal, the youngest cardinal, he's from, I think, the Byzantine Rite. You've seen him. Again, he's my age. He's like 45 years old. I can't remember his name, but he wears all the trappings of the Eastern patriarchs, and just watching video footage of the man, he radiates the peace of Christ, even through camera, which is incredible. You don't see that very often. He spoke about how not having his phone and being away from the internet was one of the most peaceful things he'd ever experienced. That's a heavy thing to say in our modern age where you can't escape the internet. It's come to rule our lives. But Mr. Ivory continues, saying, they described how moving it had been to watch Prevost as his name was read out over and over. Joseph Tobin, another Bergoglian, Cardinal Archbishop of Newark, who knows the new Pope well, having been head of the Redemptorists in Rome, when Prevost was there as a prior general of the Augustinians, said he took a look at Bob, can we please not call him that anymore, and saw that he had his head in his hands. At that moment, Tobin prayed for Prevost, because I couldn't imagine what happens to a human being when you face something like that. Yet once Prevost was elected, and on this the cardinals are unanimous, he was remarkably calm, wholly at peace. Over the next few days, Rome was struck by how effortlessly Prevost became Leo. What convinced the 133 cardinals, it turned out, had not been a great speech, but rather the way Prevost carried himself. He was humble, direct, synodal, and pastoral. As another aside, there's now theological writings coming out written for normal people to read, pointing out that all this synodality stuff is actually a direct rejection of the hierarchy of the church and a direct rejection of magisterial teachings of the church, that it's heresy. I'll cover that and see what people think about this. But synodality is now beginning to get a formal pushback from scholars as being not Catholic. That this intuitive feeling we have that there's something amiss with decentralizing authority in the church, they're now giving you the actual academic argument for it, or against it, rather. Let's continue. Prevost would be a pope in the tradition of Francis, Ivory says, yet different in ways the cardinals regarded as necessary. They sought three particular qualities in the next pope. First, they wanted someone with experience of the universality of today's church, someone familiar with its breadth and complexity. Second, they were looking for someone who could bring the peace of Christ to the divisions within the church and in the world at large. Third, they needed someone who could govern firmly, but also in a moral, more collegial manner than Francis did. Let's zoom in here on the word collegial. Collegiality. That means what they're saying here is they want Francis to be, or they want him to be more peaceful with the bishops than Francis was. Less autocratic in ordering the bishops around. Collegiality is one of these things that has been pushed by bishops in the church for a very long time to raise their power status up in the church and to diminish the power of the papacy. They tried this at Vatican II. They nearly stripped all the power of the papacy away, but Paul VI intervened. And in that, you get a lot of the modern attitude about bishops, but they still want more. There's a real attempt to take most of the power from the Pope that in a way would bring it in line with the Orthodox understanding of the papacy. It's an error, a very serious one. The more they got to know Prevost, the more he emerged as the one who fit that profile. The young cardinal who heads the Filipino Bishops' Conference, Pablo Virgilio David, said it was the Pope as Pontifex Maximus, or Supreme Bridge Builder. That is not what Pontifex Maximus means. It means supreme. It means the high priest. That became a key topic for the cardinals in the 10 days of private meetings prior to the conclave. He said Leo's brief address from the Loggia of St. Peter's after his election was virtually a summary of their discussions. Peace was his theme, the disarming peace of Christ. Leo called for a church that builds bridges and encourages dialogue, a synodal church. The next day at Mass with the cardinals in the Sistine Chapel, Leo dwelt on the great responsibility entrusted to Peter. his mission to bear witness in a world that often mocks or despises Christian faith. Back in 2013, Prevost thought he would escape being made a bishop. 10 years later, he hadn't wanted to leave behind his diocese in Peru when Francis asked him to head the dicastery for bishops in Rome. But in the end, he saw the move to Rome as a new opportunity to live a dimension of my life, simply was always answering yes when asked to do service, he told Vatican News at the time. With this spirit, I ended my mission in Peru after 8.5 years as a bishop and almost 20 years as a missionary to begin a new one in Rome. Now, the dicastery for bishops, as the prefect, his job was to choose who would become a bishop and submit it to the authority of the Pope, basically, is what his job was. Because no Pope can sit there and make all those decisions himself. You're talking thousands of men are bishops around the world. And there are a lot of retirements and things, but he had at least, it was his full-time job, basically, to approve or not the men who became bishops. If you've seen the kind of coverage I've given on the choices of bishops in the last 3 or 4 years and how things are being pushed in a certain direction, he was at least involved in that process. Ultimately, the buck stops with the Pope, and he could very well have been reacting in a way that's to directions given by Pope Francis. You will choose men who affirm this, 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 and this, right? That might be what he was doing, but it is still a bit of caution here. And now when Cardinal Parolin asked Cardinal Prevost if he accepted his election as Pope, he gave another, even more radical yes. In his homily the next day, Pope Leo described Peter being led in chains to Rome, the place of his imminent sacrifice, and said anyone in the church who exercises a ministry of authority would recognize that journey. He's 100% right about that. No criticism there. He too was being called now to disappear so that Christ may remain, to make oneself so small that he may be known and glorified. Did he ever sense that Francis had prepared his path? There's the claim. This is the claim Ivray is making here, that Francis prepared the path to the papacy for Pope Leo XIV. That this was by design of Francis. Something many of us had given voice to in the last few years, that Francis was going to do this, had somebody in mind. But he kept it very close to his chest. After his arrival in Rome in 2023 to head the dicastery for bishops, he'd been a member since 2020, Prevost and Francis used to meet for 2 hours every Saturday morning in Casa Santa Marta, where Francis lived. They discussed, of course, nominations for bishops. This addresses Mr. J.D. Flynn's claim, but also their vision of the church. Prevost was one of Francis's most trusted negotiators with the German bishops over demands that arose from their controversial synodal way process. Francis came to rely on him more and more. He trusted Prevost's decision-making and admired his way of working, the way he was able to reconcile different sides. Arthur Roach, the English cardinal who heads the dicastery for divine worship, the cardinal most responsible for crushing the traditional mass, told me, Austin Ivray, that Prevost was without doubt Francis' closest collaborator in the Vatican during the past 2 years. This is the claim that sent shockwaves online and had people trying to explain it away as merely meeting every 2 hours to discuss who was going to become a bishop or not. And Austin Ivray's counter-argument they should take seriously is that they discussed their vision of the church. Why would they do that? Aside from making sure that the bishops he chose were in line with his vision for the church. You don't need to spend that much time doing that, though. The time they spent together each week was deeply formative for Prevost, who was struck by Francis's extraordinary capacity for discernment, as well as his radical commitment to God's mercy. One morning, when the two were discussing the clerical Ted McCarrick problem, the Pope said he wanted to show Prevost something. Francis left the room and returned with a picture from a Gothic cathedral in France, which showed Judas removing himself from this mortal coil while Jesus cradled him in his arms. Was it really possible, Francis asked him, for God's mercy to reach the worst of sinners? Telling this story in a talk to a Chicago area parish in August of last year, Prevost described how Francis struggles to express and live that dimension of the gospel. It's worth noting here that Judas Iscariot is the only person the church has really ever said is definitively in hell. The only one that they have said definitively is, because you can get that from Scripture. It was this focus that had led people to misunderstand or criticize the Pope. Francis was convinced, Prevost said, that in a world full of mutual condemnation, we need people, especially ministers, who can live and offer people the mercy, forgiveness, and healing of God. In early February, with his bronchitis worsening, Francis raised Prevost's status within the College of Cardinals to bishop. Now, that's a little inside baseball stuff. Robert Prevost, as cardinal, was already a bishop, although you can be made a cardinal without being a bishop. But there are then different statuses of cardinal. There's cardinal deacon, cardinal priest, cardinal bishop. That is a distinction among the College of Cardinals within their own hierarchy of respect and authority. And I believe cardinal bishop is like the highest level. It was done so discreetly that it went mostly unnoticed even by the Vatican press corps. Again, early February, when he was very gravely ill in the hospital. Yet only a handful of others at the conclave were cardinal bishops, among them the two whom the media had dubbed the frontrunner, Papabile, Cardinals Parolin and Tagle. Was Francis sending a little posthumous hint that the list needed expanding? The bond between Bergoglio and Prevost goes back to the first decade of the new millennium, when the American was based in Rome as prior general of the Augustinians. He spent half of each year of his 12-year term visiting the 3,000 Augustinian friars and their parishes and working across the world. Extraordinary preparation for a pope of the global era, bringing him into contact with the church in Africa, Asia, and Near East, as well as in the Americas. He was often in Argentina, where the Augustinians have a vicariate with 5 parishes, 5 schools, and a formation house, and there he sat down with the famous Jesuit Archbishop of Buenos Aires. The two men had a lot in common. Both had been given major responsibilities in the religious orders from an early age. Prevost recounts that on his last visit with Archbishop Bergoglio, the two had a disagreement. Bergoglio wanted one of Prevost's friars for some project or other in his archdiocese. Prevost said no, he had other work in mind for him. The Archbishop was very unhappy about this, Prevost later learned, and so when Bergoglio was elected Pope in March 2013, Prevost, who was coming to the end of his term as prior general, joked with his brother Augustinians that he could relax. This new pope would never make him a bishop. But when Francis met Prevost again in August, after celebrating Mass for the opening of the Augustinians' general chapter, the Pope effusively thanked him for his help with resolving a problem in Rome. "You can relax for now," he said, thus hinting that he would soon be coming for him. The following year, when Prevost was back in Chicago, Francis made him apostolic administrator of Chiclayo, and a year later, its bishop, an appointment for which Prevost needed Peruvian nationality. Chiclayo is in Lambayeque, a region of northern Peru near Chulucanes and Trujillo, where Prevost missioned in his 30s and 40s. There he had been a formator of friars, a diocesan canon lawyer, and parish priest. The 1.2 million strong diocese of Chiclayo needed a makeover. For more than 30 years, it had been run by Spanish Opus Dei bishops. For the next decade, Prevost would give it a new direction, making it a diocese that modeled the ecclesiology of the Second Vatican Council. Francis had masterfully and concretely set forth that ecclesiology in his 2013 teaching, Evangelii Gaudium, as Leo XIV reminded his fellow cardinals on May 10th. In that address, delivered 2 days after his election, Leo highlighted 6 fundamental points from Evangelii Gaudium, which amounted to a program or pontificate. The first was the primacy of Christ in proclamation. As he put it in a 2023 interview, "This comes first, to communicate the beauty of the faith, the beauty and joy of knowing Jesus. It means that we ourselves are living it and sharing this experience. Be wary of the word experience when you see it coming from churchmen, no matter the office they hold. If you have read Pope St. Pius X's Pascendi Dominici Gregis, the modernists reduce religion to lived experience, to an internal feeling that they then share with others. So when they talk about sharing their lived experience, be wary. It doesn't mean what he's doing here is modernism, but it certainly sounds like it. The second was the missionary conversion of the whole Christian community, to enable others to encounter Christ in acts of mercy. The third, growth in collegiality and synodality, meant co-responsibility for the life and mission of the church. And that is right out of those documents and the arguments at Vatican II, meant to strip the papacy of power. Synodality, he told people in Chiclayo, was a way for the church to be closer to the people. The fourth, attention to the sensus fidei, meaning taking seriously the people of God as a believing, discerning subject, valuing their traditions and culture. The fifth, loving care for the least and the rejected, was the church's option for the poor, expressed in attention and concrete acts. The sixth and final point, courageous and trusting dialogue with the contemporary world. It's right out of Vatican II, right out of it. Meant a church that confronts contemporary challenges rather than offering a refuge from them. And we'll get to that as we talk about his biggest spiritual influence. Anecdotes and photos from the Pope's time as Bishop Chiclayo reveal a pastor in the classic Latin American mold. Approachable, informal, hands-on, close to the people. Chiclayanos fondly remember his affability and attentiveness as he engaged with civic authorities, mobilized funds, and created pastoral programs for prisoners, migrants, and flood victims. He turned up with oxygen tanks for makeshift treatment centers during COVID and distributed food to flood villages after Cyclone Yaku struck in the early 2023. His homilies, short, joyful, and clarifying, focused on the primary proclamation of the gospel message and the transforming impact of God's grace. Often they would return to the significance of community, of becoming the pueblo, the house that God loves, calls us to be. And that's fine. But he is remembered most for his outstanding capacity to convene, to hold people together and rearrange the decks without earning enemies. He brought firm new direction to his diocese in Peru, yet without rejecting what he had inherited. He won over the Opus Dei priests, engaged movements, and reached out to conservatives and charismatics. From the start, he brought people together in synodal assemblies to agree on pastoral priorities, to create an institution to form lay leaders. After 10 years of his work, lay people are really well trained and are positioned. His successor in Chiclayo, Bishop Edinson Farfan Cordova, also an Augustinian, told me. The content of the summer courses designed to train hundreds of lay people was drawn, says Bishop Farfan, from the social magisterium of Francis. Not just Evangelii Gaudium, but also Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti. And that is a gigantic red flag. Laudato Si is a document that puts the church at the service of essentially all the international nonprofit organizations that are trying to erase Christ in the world and replace it with this sort of green worship stuff. Gigantic red flag. And Fratelli Tutti builds on that. You like the UN, you like World Economic Forum, you like all those organizations, you're going to love Fratelli Tutti and the vision of the church in that document. In 2018, Prevost was elected vice president of the Peruvian Bishops' Conference. The church was at that time still dealing with the fallout from revelations of McCarrick stuff and corruption at the heart of the Sodalium Christianae Vitae, a right-wing Peruvian movement founded in the 1970s to combat liberation theology. Francis, one of his last acts was the suppression of the Sodalium Christianae Vitae. It was all over the news in Spain, and I was getting ready to put together a live stream on that when Francis passed away, and then it kind of got shelved. But this was they call it right-wing Peruvian movement. Here's the kicker: to combat liberation theology. The SCV enjoyed strong support from wealthy Peruvians from the Vatican under Pope John Paul II, and over the years, many bishops become entangled with the movement, especially Jose Antonio Ujaran, the Archbishop of Piura, the diocese neighboring Chiclayo. The publication of Half Monks, Half Soldiers, a devastating 2015 expose by former Sodalite Pedro Salinas and journalist Paulo Ugaz, led the SCV's powerful allies to wage legal warfare on the authors in Peru's corrupt sclerotic courts. The other effort of the book was to unleash a wave of previously untold stories of a McCarrick type, stories of people effectively kept as prisoners for years and humiliated by the power of the SCV's inner circle. And we have no proof of whether any of that was true or not. Remember how they framed this group? Right wing. Meant to counter liberation theology. Liberation theology was all but condemned by the church. It was not formally defined as a heresy because after Vatican II, the church was not in the business of defining things as heresies. But it was treated as such and countered in the social documents of John Paul II and Benedict XVI. So we get the preferential option for the poor from. Lifted right out of liberation theology, but actually corrected. As the new victims continued to step forward, Paulo Ugaz, overwhelmed, reached out to the church for help. The bishops' conference was unable to act collectively. The archbishop was involved in suing the authors, while the conference's president was reluctant to make trouble. Prevost, together with the Jesuit cardinal and the apostolic nuncio, acted on their own account, publicly declaring their support for the writers and finding ways in the next 2 years to help the victims, meaning they publicly aligned themselves with the organization that was described as right-wing anti-liberation theology. It's kind of a problem. After Prevost moved to Rome to head the dicastery of bishops, he was closely involved in the measures that led to the suppression of that organization. In 2024, Francis expelled their founder and forced out the local archbishop. He then expelled Ugurin and 9 other founders. Not long after the archbishop fell, Prevost began to be accused of hiding the victims of McCarrick-type things in the media close to them. The reports alleged that he had failed to deal properly with the case in Chiclayo. There's also a report of something like that in Chicago, but the details are scant. But it is out there. You may see it. Read it with some careful discernment, though. The diocese, of course, denied the claims, pointing out that Prevost had followed guidelines precisely. At the conclave, the right-wing Spanish group Info Vaticana recirculated the claims against Prevost, claims rejected by the Diocese of Chiclayo and by the doctrine of the Dicastery of Faith in Rome, that would be Fernandez, to try to prevent his election. A day before the conclave, Info Vaticana described him as a defeated candidate, frustrated because his aspirations to the papacy had crumbled. The quote has not worn well, and Mr. Ivray is right about that. Info Vaticana was there. In fact, Info Vaticana reported that one of their writers had encountered Austin Ivray and James Martin, who were acting as if they knew something was up at the conclave, like the day before Prevost won. And they were amicably caught talking with the man from Info Vaticana until he identified himself as a writer for Info Vaticana. And then they gave him the cold shoulder. In his meeting with the press on May 12th, Pope Leo's speech defended freedom of expression and raised his voice on behalf of journalists in prison for speaking the truth. Later, as he greeted representatives of the press, he received Ugaza's stole and posed for a photo with her. If it wasn't for Francis and Leo, we would be in jail, she said. That's no joke. Because Leo knew Francis so well and worked with him so closely, he has had time not just to learn from him, but to consider what needs to change. On May 10th, after addressing the cardinals, he asked them to spend time in silence, then meet in small groups before reconvening with him for an open floor discussion about priorities. Leo will be more collegial in his governance than Francis. That may be good, that may not be. He will seek buy-in from the Curia to press through Francis's structural reforms, which toward the end of his pontificate often fell short of being implemented. And it's clear at this point that the structural reforms they're talking about is synodality. Decentralization of the authority of the Roman pontiff and the bishops, the elevation of, bluntly, hand-picked laity to do things like run dicasteries, run parishes. That has been on the menu of choices for them for 2 years now. They've been very open about this, that they want laity running dioceses. Functionally, laity running parishes. Their way of dealing with the vocations crisis is not to foster vocations to the priesthood, but to put laity in charge of them. The worst catechized generations in history in charge of these things. Leo has already used the freedoms Francis won to make his own decisions about how to dress and where to live. He is much younger than Benedict and Francis were when they were elected. He's 8 years younger, 9 years younger than Francis was. He uses X and WhatsApp. He speaks fluent American English, but he has made clear that he will continue to build the synodal church of which Francis dreamed, while likely reformulating some of the themes of Francis's pontificate in more Augustinian terms. He will teach us how to build a celestial city alongside the earthly city, governed by the libido dominandi of the technocratic paradigm, AI, nationalism, and war. Knowing that the world will not listen to a divided church, he asked at his inauguration mass that we pray for a united church, a sign of unity and communion, which becomes a leaven for a reconciled world. He's told the journalist, quoting St. Augustine, "We are the times. Such as we are, such are the times." You can see why this caused a lot of scandal online when this was released. He is promising to finish Francis's work. That's how this is being interpreted, because that's what Austin Ivray, the papal biographer, possibly the American layman closest to Pope Francis. Notice the qualifications. American layman. Okay. Is said. The man who has written several books that are biographies of Pope Francis, as well as helped ghostwrite a few of them for him. That caused enormous scandal. Now, Bishop Strickland weighed in on this, as you might expect. When this broke, he had this to say. He said, "This is not good news." He's saying, when Matt Gaspers, he retweeting Matt Gaspers, the Prevost and Francis used to meet for 2 hours every Saturday morning in Casa Santa Marta, where Francis lived. That's the quote everybody's jumping on. But the full quote isn't just that they were going over bishops' appointments. That Mr. Ivray said explicitly that he was basically training him in his vision for the church. Bishop Strickland said, "This is not good news. We pray that Pope Leo realizes the faithful do not need a whitewashed papacy garbed in traditional vestments. We need a successor of Peter who will die for the church that Christ established, willing to be martyred like his predecessor did." And predecessors, remember the first 30 or so popes were martyrs. And that's what he's challenging him to do. Now, a canceled priest also had something to say. This would be And you have to, when covering this, we have to be extraordinarily careful in how we talk about things, because as you'll see, our hosts here on YouTube don't like this subject in the slightest. This is Father Jean Thomas Gomulka. He's a tireless advocate for those harmed by wicked men in the priesthood who have no business being in the priesthood. He is someone who has no patience for the coddling of McCarrick and James Martin type priests in the priesthood, and he has been canceled for it. And he continues to fight for those who have been harmed by men supremely evil who should not be in the priesthood, and the bishops who hide them. He says, assessment of Robert Prevost, who is no Diarmuid Martin. Apologies if pretty sure that that's an Irish name, and I have learned the hard way that Irish names are not pronounced the way that they're spelled. They're not. He says, when Ireland suffered a series of scandals of a McCarrick kind, and no bishop in Ireland had a respectable record of dealing with the problem, the Vatican had Irish-born Archbishop Diarmuid Martin transferred from a diplomatic post in Geneva and installed as the Archbishop of Dublin in 2004. The Vatican thought that Martin was a perfect choice for the position in that he had no skeletons in his closet, meaning he had not engaged in sins of the flesh with men or women, and no prior assignments where he could be accused of protecting evil men or hiding their misdeeds. The mistake the Vatican made, however, was that Martin was, unlike most bishops in the Catholic Church, he had a natural orientation and thus was more sensitive to children and had not become a priest. Had he not become a priest and had, gotten married and had kids. His sensitivity to the most young, as captured in a 60-minute segment you can watch there, caused him to be angry when he uncovered how his predecessors hid away the most young being harmed by evil priests. This anger led him to turn over 80,000 chancery files to the Murphy Commission. That was a big secular commission in Ireland that basically destroyed the faith of many people in Ireland. After that, it was like a flood of people leaving the church. Obviously, Vatican officials were upset at the scandal the released files caused. Didn't Martin know that he was sent there to hide away these things, not to report it? Again, 2004, the Vatican was doing this. As a consequence, Pope Francis never made Martin a cardinal, even though Dublin is the largest archdiocese in Ireland. Here's my Father Gomulka's take on Prevost. Most of the cardinal electors, including American cardinals like McElroy, Dolan, Gregory Tobin, had bad records involving their mishandling of these cases. And there's a long documentation he has on his blog there if you want to read it. I'll have links to all this in my show notes at returntotradition.org. Prevost did not appear like Martin in Ireland to have many skeletons in his closet. However, before putting him forward, he needed to be tested lest he, like Martin, scandalize the faithful by exposing the church's dirty laundry. Putting him to the dicastery for bishops would be a good test. Would he have any problem approving the appointment or promotion of bishops who hid away evil deeds or support doctrinal positions, like the blessings of James Martin-type pairings? Just like a criminal group might have an aspiring member do something to prove his loyalty by stealing, harming, or ending someone, so too was Prevost tasked with getting rid of Strickland for addressing this clerical problem and James Martin misconduct in the church. Yes, Cardinal Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV, was instrumental. He was like the central figure. Bishop Strickland has made this very public, very open, in having him removed from his ministry. Despite Strickland's superb record in Tyler, and there was an accusation against Bishop Strickland that he was like a bad manager. There was literally no evidence for that. But that's what the accusation the men who were sent to do the apostolic visitation made. The appointment of McElroy to Washington further demonstrated that Prevost is no Diarmuid Martin, because he was, of course, as the bishop, as a cardinal archbishop in charge of the dicastery of bishops, was key to McElroy being moved to Washington, D.C. Father Bernardin was unjustly suspended by Buffalo Bishop Richard Malone for leaking information to the media showing how Bishop Malone had been hiding away numerous evil deeds and evil types of priests. Had Malone's successor, Bishop Michael Fisher, a protege of disgraced Ted McCarrick and Donald Wuerl, again, a bishop appointed by now Leo XIV, been a good and honorable prelate, his first act would have been to reach out and invite Bernardin to return to ministry. If Prevost were a good and honorable pope, would he not have called Strickland soon after his election and restored him to active ministry? Now, to be fair, we are a couple days away from 3 weeks. So maybe that'll happen. I'm not confident that will. In fact, I think the chances of that happening are infinitesimally small. But it could happen. It could be that he was just responding to pressure from other sources. Pressure can go both ways in the hierarchy. Anyone who watches the podcast link there with Deacon Keith Fournier and argues that Strickland's removal was justified when Francis, at the same time, left Rupnik and certain heretical German bishops in office is truly nonsensical. I hope I'm wrong about my assessment of Leo XIV. However, as a canceled priest Monsignor, I doubt that anything is going to happen to the 150 bishops, 150 of them, credibly accused of doing evil things themselves, or the countless prelates guilty of hiding it all away, retaliating against those who report it. Basically, at this point, I think Prevost in reality is Francis II. That is the assessment of a priest who has spent his life trying to correct the evil deeds of wicked men in the priesthood. That's nothing to be taken lightly. I'm going to show you this, though. A lot of reading today, my apologies, but spent the weekend gathering a lot of this stuff. Pope Leo XIV has invoked Cardinal Bernardin of Chicago repeatedly. Longtime viewers know that I'm a fan of Malachi Martin's work, and for those of you who think Malachi Martin was a kook or a grifter or like an evil man, there's a book in the works that I have inside details of that is clearing the name of Malachi Martin and is bringing the receipts, as the kids say. Malachi Martin had a lot of evil things said about him, and they all started coming out after he wrote a book called The Jesuits. Malachi Martin was a Jesuit himself, and had left the Jesuit order famously, and he was secularized as a priest, not laicized. He used the word laicized because most people don't know what it means to be secularized. But he, according to people who knew him, still helped out in the diocese that he lived in later, hearing confessions and things. And there's a whole lot of other details about him coming out in that book. But in his most famous book, Windswept House, the first chapter, many people who try to read it can't get past that first chapter because it deals with a black mass that was said. And in that book, Malachi Martin said 95% of the contents are real, other 5% are fake, mostly just essentially things to string the narrative along, to help create little scenarios to make the narrative of the facts work as a story to be read. And in that book, he changed the names of the real people. But there's a priest there in South Carolina named Leonardin. The name changes weren't subtle, to put it mildly, and who in real life was Cardinal Bernardin, would later become Cardinal Bernardin. And they did a black mass where unspeakable things were done to a young girl. That woman is today alive and very real. And she has said in one or two times publicly, and without ever seeking attention, that all the events of that book were real, that she confirmed that she gave the details to Malachi Martin, and that it really did happen as he describes it. Keep that in mind. Cardinal Bernardin was the one who came up with this, the seamless garment. This is it's a theological attempt to say that the sacrifice of the most young, or now in these days, also the elderly, to Moloch, again, our hosts don't like talking about this stuff, is on the same moral level as widespread unemployment or problems with our care for our common home. It's diluting unspeakable evil problems in culture to the same level as the Fed charging too high of interest rates, or the U.S. government not being open enough or being too open with the issue of people moving around, or whatever it is. It's absolutely evil, and it came from Cardinal Bernardin. Bear that in mind. Chris Jackson at the Big Modernism Substack put together this magnificent short piece. Said, in a 2023 speech delivered while still a cardinal, Robert Prevost, now Leo XIV, lavished praise on Cardinals Joseph Bernardin and Blaise Supich, holding them up as models of a consistent ethic of life. And he's got the video footage there if you want to see it. This praise, recently spotlighted in a Where Peter Is article by Mike Lewis, should send a chill down the spine of every faithful Catholic who still clings to the perennial teachings of the Church. It is a continuation of the long march through the Church by modernist wolves and cassocks, and the lionizing of Bernardin in particular is a direct insult to the millions of unborn souls sacrificed on the altar of modern democracy. Let's be clear. Joseph Bernardin's so-called consistent ethic of life was one of the most destructive rhetorical projects in the modern Church. Under the guise of seamless moral concern, Bernardin intentionally blurred the doctrinal clarity that made Catholic moral theology intelligible and actionable. His greatest crime was equating the intrinsic evil of the sacrifice of Moloch with issues like the harshest punishment the state can do, and economic inequality. Issues that, while worthy of discussion, do not carry the same moral weight. This sleight of hand made it easier for Catholics to support pro-Molochian politicians while soothing their consciences with boilerplate references to the whole life agenda. In reality, Bernardin's framework became a Trojan horse for moral relativism, one that undermined the non-negotiable primacy of the right to exist. Traditional Catholic teaching, reaffirmed in every century until the post-conciliar collapse, has never regarded the ultimate penalty the state can impose as intrinsically evil. Pope Pius XII clearly taught that it is reserved to the public power to deprive the condemned person of the good of life in expiation of his crime, asserting that the state acts as God's instrument when justly applying that punishment. Even John Paul II, while personally discouraging its use, never called it immoral. Evangelii Vitae, he wrote that punishment should be rare, if not practically non-existent, but did not declare it an intrinsic evil. Declaring an intrinsic evil is heresy, to put it bluntly. It was Francis in 2018 who finally pushed the novelty over the edge by altering the catechism to say that it was inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person. This was a doctrinal rupture, suggesting that for 2,000 years the church had taught and practiced something fundamentally immoral. It was a form of theological gaslighting, pretending the Holy Ghost was asleep for 2 millennia and only recently woke up to the United Nations standard on human rights. Leo XIV is now called Bernardin a model and Supich a faithful heir. Supich, who was perhaps best known for promoting intercommunion for Protestants, that's sacrilegious communion, go back to what St. Paul says about that, attempting to marginalize traditional liturgy and burying the McCarrick scandals, represents the American face of modernism. To lift up these men as exemplars of the consistent ethic of life is to canonize the betrayal of moral clarity. When he speaks of upholding the dignity of life while implicitly affirming Francis's errors, he extending the revolution. And when he celebrates the seamless garment as a Catholic ideal, he confirms that his papacy will double down on the collapse. And he goes on and on and on. Let's go down to here. The real seamless garment is in the betrayal. When Leo praises men like Bernardin and Supich, when he echoes Francis's heretical stance on the ultimate penalty, and when he pushes a politically loaded view of immigration that ignores church tradition, he causes division through doctrinal rupture. This is not charity. This is about redefining Catholicism in such a way that the faith becomes indistinguishable from the tyrants. This is not the church of the martyrs. This is the church of Davos with a chalice and incense. To those who believe in the church of all time, who still hold to the moral clarity of preconciliar tradition, the message must be clear. We will not accept the seamless garment. We will not remain silent while the most vicious way of removing somebody is relativized, while borders are erased, while death itself is rebranded as dignity. And we will not pretend that Joseph Bernardin, the man who made it easier for Catholics to vote for that absolute evil, is a prophet. It cannot be understated that calling Bernardin and Supich exemplars of the church's life ethic, that cannot be understated that is a red flag. It's not a red flag. That's a tornado klaxon going off. Bernardin was one of the worst men in the American hierarchy in the entire history of the United States, if not the worst. Perhaps only overshadowed by Ted McCarrick. The effect he had on Catholics is only now being shaken off. This goes back to a secret meeting with members of the Kennedy family in the 60s with some Jesuits who helped come up with this stuff to make it so Catholic politicians could support things that were fundamentally opposed to the church's teaching, and then give Catholics an excuse to supporting them. And we've dealt with the consequences of that for 60 years. You see it today in stuff that even J.D. Vance says about IVF. The effect of this has been catastrophic. He's not an exemplar of the church's teaching. Bernardin isn't, no, by any stretch, certainly not Blaise Supich. You see this all across the church. In fact, Bernardin has had such an effect that this next story is actually, in a weird way, tangentially related. We know that one of the biggest things that the modernists are going for is the ordination of women. They want the diaconate, and from the diaconate they'll become priestesses, because once you ordain them to the diaconate, you have no logical excuse for not making them priestesses. And once they're priestesses, you have no logical argument against them becoming bishopettes. You have no argument. And once they're a bishop, well, what's after being a bishop? A cardinal. And what's after a cardinal? This is what they want. There have been numerous organizations fighting for this for a long time. Some of them with like one foot in the secular world and the other in the life of the church. Oftentimes in the secular world, they stand against the good work of the church in opposing grave evils in the culture. And you will find no better example of an enemy of the church than in these organizations among the laity. Never underestimate the power of lay people to do evil things in the church, especially when their entire purpose as an organization is to prove that the church got it wrong for its entire history. Go to Catholic Conclave with the headline, Swiss Catholic Women's Federation votes to remove Catholic from their name, a logical consequence of synodalism. As I've said recently, there's a bunch of scholarship coming out now from some fairly well-known figures who are pointing out synodality is itself heresy, that it is a dismantling of the hierarchical nature of the church as established by Jesus Christ. And they're using the word heresy to describe it. This is, of course, a good example of this in action. Now, you might say, as a counter-argument to what you're about to hear, a group of Catholics who were calling themselves Catholic, but who are really heretics, stopping to calling themselves Catholic as an organization might not be a bad thing. And to a degree, you'd be right. But it also strips them of their mission. It removes the illusion of what they're doing. The details from this article. The delegates of the Swiss Catholic Women's Federation voted by a clear majority to remove the term Catholic from their name. The National Umbrella Organization is now called something in German that I'm not going to destroy. The Swiss Catholic Women's Federation is now called that. The name includes a slogan, surprisingly different Catholic. At their meeting on May 23rd, the delegates voted 153-5 in favor of the name change. The motion was submitted to the association's board of directors and had generated considerable media attention beforehand. Katharina Jost, designated co-president, summarized the reasons for the name change before the vote. The previous name was cumbersome, and the abbreviated SKF was not understood. The term Catholic has negative connotations and associated with clericalism and the hiding away of McCarrick-type problems by 80% of the population. Thanks to the bishops who did this. They're not wrong by that, by the way. She emphasized that nothing would change in the content and values of the Women's Association. The Women's Association continues to stand for a good life for all. However, we are not managing to present Catholic in a positive light. We believe Jesus Christ would say, "You will not recognize them by their names, but by their actions," Jost said. A vote that sparked spontaneous applause and already served as a barometer for the final vote. This is where the anti-clericalist rhetoric of Pope Francis, Catholic is now a badge of shame. In the discussion before the vote, it became clear that Christian values and the church's roots in the Catholic Church were not questioned by either supporters or opponents of the name change. Despite everything, we are still Catholic. We are not giving up our Catholic identity. It's about the heart of our name. Catholic is more than just a word. It is our foundation, the source of our inspiration and values, were some of the comments from those opposed to the name change. And they are right. They ran away from the name Catholic. It's a little like, somebody asking you, are you a papist? Are you a Catholic? And you say, and you kind of hem and haw about it. You just call yourself a Christian instead. You should never run away from the name Catholic. In that same way, you should never hesitate to try to bring people to the faith and try to get them to enter the church, despite there being Judases in the hierarchy. Approximately the same number of women voted in favor of the name change. We are all still Christians. We finally no longer excluding anyone. Finally, we are no longer excluding anyone because the name Catholic was excluding people. The women were asked to counter the fear that church donors might withdraw support by saying, then he won't receive any more of our services. They have now turned themselves into a protection racket, says CathCon. The main topic of discussion at the meeting was whether and how binding the slogan surprisingly different Catholic should be in the name. A motion to include the slogan as a visual element of the logo was passed by 100 votes to 57. However, the slogan remains a communication measure for the time being. Whether it should be included as part of the name in the statutes will be decided at the 2026 General Assembly. The individual delegates were free to vote for or against the name change. The new name applies only to the National Umbrella Organization. The cantonal associations, but your provincial ones, your local provinces, again, Switzerland, as well as local groups are free to choose their own names. 89% of local associations do not have Catholic in their name. The intensity of the discussion surprised but also pleased the board, said outgoing president at the beginning of the meeting. However, some threats from members of church bodies addressed to cantonal or provincial associations, saying they would no longer write letters of recommendation if the umbrella organization would change its name, were disconcerting. And in some of these, pushback came from bishops. The former president bid farewell with a standing ovation. She had chaired the Women's Association for 9 years, and they elected 2 women as new co-president. This marks the first time the Women's Association has a co-president. That's very synodal of them, by the way. She also represents the first time a theologian has been appointed to the presidency. So this is an organization that fought for women's rights and things, that took the word Catholic out of their name. That's synodality, folks. That really is. The entire point of synodality, part of it is ecumenical dialogue. And this is not just Catholics talking to Lutherans, trying to heal old divisions. That's the kind of ecumenical dialogue that actually makes sense. Trying to heal the divisions caused by schism and apostasy in the church. That makes total sense, and no thinking Catholic argues against it. But the other kind of ecumenical dialogue is essentially ecumenical dialogue with the pagan world, and adopting their values as a norm and treating them as if they have anything to teach the church. Well, that goes something Ann Barnhart said in her most recent podcast. One that'd be very too spicy for a lot of people. Not just because of the language she uses in it, but because of the challenge she makes to a lot of commentators. And she asked, to paraphrase her, what in the world do we have to learn from the pagan world as Catholics? What do we have to learn? Nothing. There's nothing. The church has the gospel. The church was founded on the rock of Peter by Christ himself. He explicitly told the apostles, "He who hears you hears me." We know that the offices of the apostles were filled by other men. It shows you right in Acts that happened. We know this happened all throughout history. We have the records to show it. There are patriarchates that go back to the apostles, unbroken lines of succession. What in the world do we have to learn from those who utterly reject Christ or try to diminish him in some way to being a mere prophet? What do we have to learn from them? And yet this is at the heart of synodality. What do we have to learn to those who reject the very concept of God? You see it in that organization we just talked about. But do you see why all this caused a huge scandal in the last week? I'm very curious what you have to say about this. Live chat is very, very active this morning, which it should be. A couple dissenters from the magisterium of the church in the chat. Okay, well, let's take a look. Oh boy. Jesus never said women can't be priests, so you're just assuming. Okay, bye. He chose men. No one disputed that until the 60s. Janet puts it mildly, saying the only thing we have to learn from the pagan world is how horrible hell on earth is, because hell is life without God. Essentially, yeah. But I'm very curious what people have to say about this. So let me know in the comments. Do you have a good counter argument to what Austin Ivray said in that first article, that long article we went over? Do you have a good counter argument to what Chris Jackson at Big Modernism blog had to go over? Bernardin is not a figure that should be lauded by anybody in the church. Anybody, but especially not the Pope. Bernardin is one of the great villains in the story of the 20th century church. He is one of the men. If you want to hear more about Bernardin, Ann Barnhart's most recent podcast episode goes into a lot of detail. If you're aware of Bella Dodd's School of Darkness, where she talked about how she was essentially a Marxist who recruited men for the priesthood who should not be there, Ann Barnhart makes the claim that Prevost was recruited as such, or that Bernardin rather was recruited in such a way. Not Prevost, Bernardin was. He came from a lukewarm Catholic family and lived a very James Martin lifestyle. Until one day he came home from college and said he was going to seminary. I'd like to know what her source on that is. And if you're seeing this somehow, Love to hear from you on that, what the source is on that information, so it can be explored. And I don't present all this to you lightly. Pray for Leo. Pray for the Pope, whether you think he's Pope or not. Let me know what you think about this in the comments, please. Like, subscribe. If you haven't, it certainly does help. You can please post a link to her podcast. I'll put it in my show notes today at returntotradition.org. It'll be there in the show notes. I can't, YouTube does not want me to post a link in anything here to something that is on a competing platform. That is absolutely a violation of their terms of service. So let me know what you think about this in the comments, though. Like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly helps. Sharing this on social media helps a lot, too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.